Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Welcome to my video on writing a literature review in counseling research. So let's start with the purpose of a literature review. A literature review summarizes the important findings related to the topic of the manuscript. In counseling research, the topic is oftentimes a problem that we are trying to solve as counselors. So a mental health disorder or the symptoms from mental health disorder that we want to alleviate. Sometimes the topic is the treatment itself. And in cases like that, we could be looking at how that treatment addresses many different types of disorders, symptoms, problems, or difficulties in functioning. A literature review informs readers as to the state of the counseling field as it relates to the topic. So we think of science in terms of building blocks, that authors that have written articles before us have contributed building blocks to the counseling field, and there was a certain process and progression to adding those building blocks to the field. So we're telling the readers what the state of the field is now, and also a little bit about the history, so how we arrived at the current state of the field. In a literature review, we want to demonstrate why it is important or necessary to study the topic further. So you may be examining a particular disorder or treatment, and you may believe it's important to the counseling field for the topic to be studied further, but in the literature review, you have to explain why it's important, thereby justifying the need for the study that you are proposing. And toward the end of the literature review, you'll have a research question, a hypothesis, or several research questions and several hypotheses. And the literature review, before that point, establishes a context for those research questions and hypotheses. So let's take a look at the structure of the literature review. Near the beginning of the literature review, you want to have broad statements about the topic, but not global. So for example, if you were talking about depression that might occur, or depressive symptoms that might occur during grieving, you would want to make some broad statements about depressive symptoms related to grieving, but not necessarily broad statements about depression in general. Because depending on your research questions and hypotheses, that may be outside the scope of your paper. As the literature review progresses, you want to demonstrate why the topic is important. You want to discuss what has been written on the topic so far. If the topic is a mental health disorder or a set of symptoms, you then want to introduce the treatment. Now, it's worth noting here that you can also handle this the other way. You can introduce the treatment and talk about why it's important, and then bring up a mental health disorder or mental health symptoms that treatment was designed to address. You want to report findings that illustrate the relationship between the treatment and the problem. And what's important to note here is that you're looking for a gap in the literature where you can fit your study. So if there already have been a lot of articles written about your specific treatment and the problem that you want to apply it to, you really haven't found a good gap there to write about. But if there's a lot of papers that have the treatment being used for a certain problem, and you're using a different version of the treatment, or you are addressing a slightly different problem, that may be the gap you need to justify proposing a study. And toward the end of the literature review, you want to propose a research question or multiple research questions that, when answered, will provide a valuable step forward in counseling that will form another building block of knowledge in the counseling field. One thing to keep in mind here when proposing research questions is later on in the discussion section, which is a separate section from the literature review, you're going to want to link back to those research questions and make sure that you have adequately answered all of them. So sometimes it helps to number the research questions, and sometimes the way to present them in a literature review that's convenient and practical is in an outline format, as opposed to having them be in a narrative format. But whether you use an outline format or a narrative format, I think it's important to number or otherwise label the research questions so they're easy to reference later on in the paper outside of the literature review. So I want to give you an example of the organization of a literature review. And there's a few different theories behind how to organize a literature review. The popular theories include what I have here, which is kind of a broad to narrow approach, or a funnel approach to organization. Another theory is chronological, which certainly has a place for certain types of studies. And then there's another theory that focuses on themes, a thematic organization, where you move from one theme to another throughout the literature review. Elements of both the thematic approach and the chronological approach can be found in the broad to narrow approach that I have here, which is one of the reasons I like this particular way of organizing a literature review. Now, this is often depicted as a funnel, and that would be where these, you can see I have it kind of stair-stepped, and often this is pictured with straight lines, like it's a continuous narrowing. But when writing in paragraph form, your literature review comprises paragraphs, I like to think of it more as a stair step. So you're going to have a paragraph or a few paragraphs introducing your topic, a few others discussing the impact of the problem. So you're going to have groups of paragraphs. So each paragraph isn't necessarily going to be more narrow or more specific to your research questions and hypotheses than the one before it. But generally, each group of paragraphs, as you've grouped them, will move from broad to narrow. So I have an example here of a topic treating clinical depression with cognitive behavior therapy. Of course, it would be no surprise that there are many, many articles that cover this. I'm just using this as an example to show you how to organize literature review. So after introducing your topic, the next level down might be, what is the human, societal, and financial impact of depression? So this would talk about why it's important that we address depression. Depression is a serious or potentially serious mental health disorder, depending on the severity, and it has a tremendous human, societal, and financial impact. These are good reasons to study it, and good reasons to develop treatments that can successfully treat depression. Then as you move a little bit closer to your specific research questions and hypotheses, you may want to talk about what causes depression. So you'll be talking about etiological and epidemiological factors as they relate to depression. Then moving down to the next level, you might want to talk about what are the current methods of treating depression. So what do we do right now in the counseling field to address depression and to treat depressive symptoms? And here it's important to keep in mind that you would not only talk about counseling treatments, but also pharmacological treatments and other methods of treating depression. Then you want to move down to how successful are the current treatments. So how well are they working? Perhaps some work well for certain types of depression where others don't. Perhaps some of the successful treatments take a lot of time or are very expensive, and you're proposing a brief therapy. So there's a few different subject matters you could address in that particular level. Then you might want to introduce cognitive behavior therapy, because it is the focus of your study, and you've already made a case that depression is something we need to treat, and you've talked about other ways to treat depression. Now you introduce the treatment that you'll be studying in your manuscript. Moving another level down, you might say, how has it worked to treat depression in the past? So clearly cognitive behavior therapy has been used to treat depression. So in your study, perhaps you're looking at a particular type of cognitive behavior therapy, and there are many types. So you'd want to give a brief history of how CBT has been used to treat depression. Then you might want to propose and then answer the question, why might it work better than other modalities in this study? Considering, as I mentioned before, that depending on the severity of depression and the individual, depression can be very serious. So rather than a control group where a certain number of participants receive no treatment, it would be more likely that they would receive treatment as usual or treatment from another modality that you're testing. So again, here you might want to ask why this CBT might work better than other modalities you're testing in the study, and then support that using sources you've found. And then toward the end of the literature review, we typically summarize what we've talked about in the literature review so far, and then we propose our research questions, followed by our hypotheses. So now let's talk about writing the literature review. And here are a few important points I want to review. Remember that you want to include findings from other studies. When you're writing your literature review, that's the key thing that you're reporting from those other studies, what they found. Now when you're writing your methods section, for example, you may cite other authors' methodology, but for a literature review, you are reporting their findings. You're going to report results that support and challenge the need for your study. We cannot just simply take the articles that support the need for our study. We have to also include results that challenge the need for our study. It's important to remember to locate primary sources if you're looking to include information from another author's literature review. So do not cite the content from the literature review of another article. You have to find the primary source. So when reading a literature review for an article that you're going to cite, you may see something very related to your topic, which would not be uncommon, and you may want to include that information in your article. But you can't cite another author's literature review. They've already cited a source. You have to find that source. There are rare exceptions to that rule in instances where the primary source is no longer accessible, for example, but for the vast majority of the time, you have to locate the primary source, and you should be able to. Try to avoid writing paragraphs in which all the sentences are cited from the same source. Now, I say try to avoid because I realize that this is hard to do, and it's not always practical to do this. If you found a particularly relevant article that has a lot of findings related to your article, the best way to introduce that information may be by writing a paragraph that is exclusively cited from one source. But in general, try to avoid doing that. Try to synthesize citations from multiple sources throughout paragraphs whenever possible. It's not uncommon behind one sentence to have 2, 3, 4 citations that support that sentence. Good synthesis of citations throughout paragraphs is an indicator of good writing, and it lends strong support to the different points that you're trying to make because you have multiple sources that support those points. I recommend pulling the findings from articles first, then organizing and writing a manuscript. You can think of the articles that you pull, or the findings that you pull from articles, as the fuel that powers your manuscript, or the building blocks that you use to build your manuscript. So you're going to want to have those findings selected and separated, perhaps by theme or by what level you're going to introduce it in your paper. And then when you have all that together, then start to organize those findings and begin writing your literature review. As you write your literature review, you may notice there are certain holes in it that you want to fill, certain areas that you haven't covered well with the articles that you found. You can always go back and pull more findings from the articles. I would just recommending pulling a good deal of results from articles first, dividing them up, then organize in writing. And finally, I want to answer the question, how many references are needed? Another way you could put this is how many references are appropriate. Now, kind of the classic answer to this question is as many as it takes, but that's actually not a realistic answer. Journals have limits on how large manuscripts can be, and that means we need to make cuts if we have a manuscript that's too large for a journal's requirements. So we do have to select references to include, and we have to identify references that we're going to exclude. The important thing to remember here is we want balance. So if we have 20 articles that support the need for our study, and we've found, say, 6 articles that show that our study is not important, when we go to cut references down, we can't exclude the 6. You want to exclude them proportionally. So for example, if you needed to cut the number of references in half, you might include 10 from the articles that support the need for your study, and 3 from the articles, from the group of articles that don't support your study. You want to make sure as you're reviewing a manuscript before submission that you have enough references to adequately cover the literature review. So if you have sentences in the literature review that were not your own idea, they were somebody else's idea, there needs to be a citation there. If you don't want that citation, if you don't want to use that reference, then you have to take that sentence out. So it's easy to see why even relatively short manuscripts can have a good number of references. Again, if just about every sentence has at least 1, and some sentences have 2, 3, or 4 or more citations, then your reference list is going to build pretty fast. So if you do set out to reduce the number of references that you're citing, you are going to end up reducing the number of words you use in your literature review. So to answer the question, how many references are needed, you need enough references to sufficiently cover the material you've included in your literature review, being mindful that you will have multiple references cited for some sentences. Having too many references isn't usually a large problem, but having too few is definitely a large problem. I hope you found this video on writing a literature review in counseling research to be helpful. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to contact me, and I'll be happy to assist you.